Have you ever stumbled across a story online that hits you so hard it doesn't even feel like just some random post? Today I was scrolling through Reddit and found a few stories like that. Way too real, way too creepy to ignore. I've got a feeling you're going to want to hear these. So, no more waiting, let's dive right in.
Story 1.
Initially, my memories of the crash were limited. A fractured, imperfect recollection missing crucial details. When I tried to remember those details, a series of jumbled images played in my mind, like I was reviewing a handful of blurry, out-of-focus Polaroids that someone had shuffled into a non-chronological order. Over time, that changed. My memories became clearer. But in the beginning, everything was a haze of motion and sound. This is what I remembered in the beginning. Divya and I are sitting next to each other. The other two passenger seats on the opposite side of the aisle are empty. The pilot turns around to us, and I only see him for a second, but there's something memorable about him. It's not the fear stitched to his face, nor is it the words he shouts to us. It's something else, something important. My sister's smiling, big brown eyes alive with infectious excitement. Her lips are moving, trying to tell me something over the mechanical thrums of the aircraft's single engine. I peer out the window, watching the Alps pass under us. Verdant, green valleys. Smatterings of pine trees dotting the landscape, forming unique and cryptic shapes like geological birthmarks. Not birthmarks, actually. More like scars, which is an important distinction, and I don't know why. An ear-splitting noise. It's deafening and sudden, like an explosion, but there's no fire. Not first, at least. The gnawing and grinding of metal. Screams. From me, Divya, the pilot, and from someone else. Maybe there was someone else on the plane. The aircraft tilts forward. We enter a death spiral. Violent movement rips the pilot from his chair, and he's gone. There's something important about him. It's not the fear on his face, it's something else. Before I can tell what it is, we're meters from the ground. There's the roaring of atmosphere rushing through the holes in the cabin. Terror swells in my throat. I want to turn my head. I want to see my sister. But there's not enough time. Everything goes black. I'm plunged into the heart of a deep, silent shadow. It's not death, but it's similar. Briefly, I return. My consciousness bubbles up from the depths of that shadow, and my eyes flutter open. It's quiet now. No more screams. No more chewing of metal. Only the humming chorus of cicadas fills my ears. It was early morning when we crashed. Now it's twilight. Air moves through my lungs, and it smells faintly of smoke and iron. Finally, I do turn my head, and I see Divya. She's not far, but she's broken. Her battered body hangs in a nearby oak tree like a warning. Dusky red blood stains the bark around Divya. It's sticky and warm on my fingertips when I'm close enough to touch it, leaning against the trunk, reaching to pull her down from the canopy. She's much too high up, but I keep flinging my hands towards the heavens, pleading for a miracle. Again and again, I try to get a hold of Divya, as if I'd be able to anchor her soul to the earth with a tight enough grasp on her body. I blink, and when I open my eyes, I'm alone in a hospital room, lying in bed. Now, there's no noise at all. Pure, vacuous silence for hours and hours as I slip in and out of awareness, until a question shatters that silence. "What do you remember about what happened to you, son?" says a tall, grizzled man in a dirty white lab coat, gray-blue eyes intensely fixed on my own. That first week in the hospital went by quickly. Dr. Osler and Nurse Annalise were very attentive, practically at my beck and call. My suspicions were at a minimum during that time, so I could actually lay back and rest. When I was finally lucid enough, I explained what I recalled about the crash to Dr. Osler, who listened intently from a wooden chair aside the hospital bed. My sister and I were Boston natives on holiday in the European countryside. We were flying over the Swiss Alps when something went terribly wrong with the plane. I couldn't remember if it was a spontaneous mechanical failure or if the pilot had accidentally collided with something. Either way, we fell to the earth like Icarus. I thought of Divya. A question idled in my vocal cords for a long while, a leech with hooked teeth buried in the flesh of my throat, resisting release. Eventually I asked. Courage was the spark, apathy was the match. The resulting fire singed that leech off my throat and out my mouth. Either she was alive or she wasn't. Do you know if my sister made it to the hospital? Brown hair, mole on her cheek? The doctor inquired, his voice warm and dulcet like a sip of hot apple cider, spiked with brandy. I gulped and nodded, bracing myself. Yes, we have her here. She's in critical condition, but we're taking such good care of her. We believe she'll pull through, but she hasn't woken up yet. Relief galloped through my body, and I let my head fall back on the pillow, tears welling under my eyes. As I quietly wept, he continued to fill in the gaps, detailing where I was, how I got here, and what was next. Essentially, the plane crash-landed outside of Bavaria, southeast Germany. A farmer watched our meteoric descent from the sky and immediately called for an ambulance. Now, my sister and I were admitted to a small county hospital about 10 minutes from the wreck site. Both of my legs were broken, and I lost a significant amount of blood, but otherwise, I was intact. Divya suffered greater internal injuries, so she was in the intensive care unit. Dr. Osler expected her to make a full recovery. There were no other survivors. He stood up, patted me on the shoulder, told me to sleep, and informed me that Annalise would be in soon to record my vital signs. When can I see her? When can I see my sister? His footfall slowed until they came to a complete stop. He remained motionless for an uncomfortably long period of time, with his hand wrapped around the brass doorknob and his back to me. Never said a word. After about a minute of eerie inaction, he twisted the knob, pulled the door open, and left. That's when I first noticed something about my situation was desperately wrong. As the doctor exited my well-lit, windowless hospital room, I glimpsed whatever was outside. In an attempt to conceal it, he didn't swing the door wide open. Instead, he cracked it only slightly, just enough to squeeze his gaunt body through the partition, with his lab coat audibly dragging against the door frame. Despite his attempt to block my view, I saw enough to plant a seed of doubt in my head about Dr. Osler and what he had told me. A clock on the wall read noon, but whatever was outside the door was pitch black. The foreboding darkness outside my room was only the first domino to fall, though. Once I fully registered the uncanniness of that detail, a handful of other equally bizarre details came to the forefront of my mind, and I did not have a satisfactory explanation for any of them. For example, the hospital was completely silent. No PA system asking for the location of a particular surgeon or announcing that visitor hours were over. No ambient noise from a heavy hospital bed thundering down the hallway. Even my room was dead silent. Initially, I didn't notice. The quiet allowed me to fall into sleep without issue. That said, I was wearing an oxygen monitor. I had it for my arm. The machines above me appeared to be connected to both things, and yet they were silent too. Shouldn't they beep? Shouldn't they make some kind of sound? The only noises I ever heard were the voices of the hospital's staff members, and only when they were in my room, talking to me. Which brings me to Nurse Annalise. Initially, she was a tremendous source of comfort. Her very presence was sedating, humble and grandmotherly. Silver hair, bustling over her shoulders as moved through the room. A charming, wrinkled smile on her face as she listened to me recount my life history to kill some time. Constant reassuring words about how well the hospital was taking care of me. But like everything else, once I looked a little harder, Annalise went from likable and endearing to peculiar and terrifying. First off, it seemed like she never left the hospital. For a week straight, she was my only nurse, coming and going from my room at random times. Never anything that implied a shift schedule. One day, she came into my room 3 times within an hour to take my temperature, and didn't appear again until the following day. Another time, I woke up to her determining my blood pressure, the rubbery cuff tightly compressing my bicep. No stethoscope pressed to my arm, which I'm pretty sure is required for the measurement. She wasn't even watching the numbers rise and fall on the instrument's pressure meter. Instead, she was staring right at me, reciting the same phrase over and over again. Aren't we taking such good care of you? Aren't we taking such good care of you? Aren't we taking such good care of you? All the while, she was continuously inflating the cuff, pausing for a moment, releasing the air, and then repeating that process. I just pretended to be asleep at first, But after an hour of that, my patience ran thin. Annalise, don't you ever go home? Or are you the only goddamn nurse in this whole hospital? I shouted. The cuff's deflating hiss punctuated the tension, slowly fading to silence over a handful of seconds. Eventually, she stood up, walked to the door, and exited, saying nothing at all. The behavior reminded me of how Dr. Osler reacted when I asked him about Divya. Honestly, I never saw Annalise again. Not alive, at least. Every single nurse from then on out was different than the last. Like somehow, my singular complaint had rewritten the entire staffing infrastructure of the hospital. And I mean every single one. Now, instead of having one nurse day in and day out, I've been visited by 30 different nurses over the course of a few days. It didn't make any sense. I asked for different nurses, and that's sure as shit what I got. After about a month in that room, and with my suspicions rising, I started developing an escape plan. The only thing that was really holding me back was my casts. Since the day I woke up in the hospital, thick, marble white plaster completely encased each of my legs. The casts didn't appear to have been applied by a professional, though. The surfaces weren't smooth, they were rough and bubbling. Some areas clearly had more plaster than others, and there didn't appear to be a rhyme or reason for that asymmetry. Not only that, but the material seemed unnecessarily dense and heavy, and the casts were tightly molded to each extremity. It was nearly impossible for me to move on my own, almost like they were created to function like chains shackling me to that bed. Are my legs truly even broken? I considered, panic sweeping through me like a wildfire. I want to see my sister, I demanded. The nurse, a short man with a thick brown-red beard, dropped the clipboard he had been scribbling on in response to my defiance. It clattered to the floor. With a vacant expression painted on his face, he walked over to the door, opened it, and left. As the door creak closed, I grimaced. The uncertainty of the oppressive darkness that lingered outside my room had, over time, begun to cause me physical discomfort. I needed to know what was actually out there, but God, I desperately didn't want to know either. In a way, it represented my predicament. On the surface, I was in a hospital, but that was farce, an illusion for someone's benefit. In reality, some terrible darkness loomed around me, pulsing just below the surface, spilling in every so often through the cracks in a masquerade. After a few minutes, Dr. Osler paced into the room, letting the door sway shut behind him. Dr. Osler, you've told me Divya is alive. Countless times, you've assured me she's recovering here in this hospital. And yet, I haven't seen her once. Bring her here. If she's not healthy enough to come here, bring me to her. His gray-blue eyes bored vicious holes through me. He was livid, utterly incensed by my insubordination. She's not done yet, he muttered. I stared back at him, dumbfounded and brimming with rage. What the fuck does that mean? The doctor looked away from me with a contemplative glint behind his eyes, recalibrating his response. With his head turned to the side, though, I felt another emotion simmer inside my skull, an uncomfortable familiarity. As I studied a subtle, skin-tone line that coiled down the side of his nose, my mind was pulled to the day of the crash. Before that horrible realization could fully crystallize, he spoke again. Dive is not ready for visitors, All right, well, what's the holdup? Tell me why she's not ready. His gaze met mine again, now grim and resolute. Soon, as that word crawled from his lips, he turned away from me and marched out into the darkness. I said nothing. No protestations, no name-calling, no angry last words. Instead, I felt my mind race. My nervous system buzzed with furious static, trying to comprehend and reconcile the overflow of information bombarding my psyche. Something about the way Dr. Osler's face contorted as he said that last word made the whole thing click into place. The pilot had a scar just like that. I could see it clear as day in my head, and I could finally recall what he said to Divya and me as he turned towards us from the cockpit, fear stitched on his face. Something just landed on the wing. Moments later, that something violently ripped him from the plane. The impossibility of that realization lulled me to sleep like a concussion, Mental exhaustion just shut my body down minutes after the pilot/Dr. Osler left the room. When I awoke, it was midnight. I had been asleep for a little over 6 hours. I may have slept for longer had it not been for a sharp, stabbing pain in my low back. My salvation disguised as agony. I pushed my torso forward, twisting my hand behind my back to dig for the source of the pain. After a few seconds, my fingers landed on the curve of something metallic that had punctured through the fabric of the ancient bedding. Once I recognized the spiral object, my eyelids excitedly shot open. It was a tempered steel spring. Time and use had eroded the tip to where it had become sharp. The thing wasn't a buzzsaw by any means, but it was something accessible that could maybe dig through the plaster casts that were preventing my escape. However, before I could start trying to tear the spring out, a disturbing change compelled my attention. For the first time in a month, there was no light in my hospital room. As I scanned the darkened scenery, attempting to orient myself, I noticed something else as well. Something that pried the wind from lungs, leaving me breathless and silently begging for air. A motionless blob of contoured shadow in the corner. Someone was in the room with me. Who's there? I whimpered. The silhouette sprung to life, stepping forward until they were looming over the end of my bed. When it grinned, my heart leapt, dancing between relief, disbelief, and terror, never staying on one emotion for too long before moving on to the next in the cycle. Divya, at first, she nodded her head slowly, but over a few seconds, her nodding sped up, becoming frantic. Inhumanly quick vertical pivots that seemed to have enough force to shatter the spine in her neck. Greedy paralysis enveloped my body. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could just watch as Divya lumbered around the side of the bed until she was right over top of me, still rabidly shaking her head up and down. As she bent over the bed's railing, the nodding stopped abruptly. Nearly forehead to forehead, my sister finally responded. Yes, it's me. Don't worry, okay? In fact, don't ask about me. I'm Fina. They're taking such good care of us here. Her eyes were no longer brown. They were gray-blue, like Dr. Osler's, like Nurse Annalise's, like every nurse's eyes, actually. And with that, she stood up, turned away, and walked out the door. From that night on, I accepted my sister was dead. With my attention undivided, I worked singularly towards escape. Grief could come later, after I was away from the thing that had killed her and commandeered her body. Disassembling the casts with the sharpened end of the spring was laborious. Every minute that thing wasn't in the room, I was scraping away at the plaster, making sure to focus my efforts on the underside of the mold rather than the outside. That way, if it inspected the cast, it wouldn't be as obvious that I had been incrementally weakening the plaster. If it was in the room, camouflaged as a real human, I smiled. Engaged in pleasant conversation, profusely displayed my gratitude, thanked it every chance I got. That's what it really wanted, I suppose. It wanted to feel appreciated. Giving it appreciation kept it docile. Eventually, I could tell that I had damaged the cast to the point where I could break myself loose with a few more forceful hits. Once I did, however, I knew there was no going back. My intention to slip out of its clutches would be written all over my freed legs. And as much as I attempted to discern a pattern to its appearances in my room, I just don't think there was one. Unfortunately, that meant there wasn't a right time to make my escape. I had to guess and pray it wasn't nearby when I made my move. Luck was on my side that day. The thing was close, but it was preoccupied, despite shedding nearly 20 pounds of body weight in that hospital room. Barely sustaining myself on the infrequent helpings of brackish meat, soup the thing brought me. My legs couldn't hold me upright. They had simply atrophied too damn much. Muscleless sleeves burdened with fragile bones and calcified tendons. Thankfully, my arms had retained enough strength to drag my emaciated body across the floor. With my back propped up against the wall aside the door, I halted my feeble movements and just listened. No footsteps running down the hall. No whispers of, "Are we taking such good care of you?" coming from right outside. All I could hear was the fevered thumping of my heart slamming into my ribs. I took a deep breath, reached my arm up to the knob, and slowly slid the door open. It wasn't hell on the other side of the door, like my restless mind had theorized on more than one occasion. Not in the literal sense, anyway. I really was in a hospital, it was just abandoned. Had been for a while, apparently. A discarded German newspaper, I discovered, was dated to September of 1969. The dilapidated medical ward was dimly lit by the natural light that filtered in from various broken windows. Thick dust, shattered glass, and skittering insects littered the floor. I crawled around overturned crash carts and toppled transport beds like I was navigating the tunnels and trenches of Okinawa. At the very end of the hallway, I spied a patch of weeds illuminated by rays of bright white light. There was my escape, an open doorway, a portal to the world outside this place. Flickers of hope were quickly overshadowed by smoldering fear. As I got closer and closer to the exit, an unidentifiable smell was becoming more and more pungent. A mix of rotting fish, bleach, and tanning leather. The thing wasn't gone. It was still here, and when the aroma became truly unbearable, I knew I had reached the place it called home. I didn't see everything when I crawled by, but because the door had been ripped off its hinges and a massive hole in the ceiling was casting a spotlight over its profane workshop, I saw enough to understand. As much as I possibly could understand, anyway. The chamber that the stench was originating from was vast and cavernous. Maybe it served as a lecture hall or a cafeteria at some point in time. Now, though, it had a different purpose. It was where the thing kept its costumes. That abomination had pretended to be every person I'd interacted with while in that hospital. Dr. Osler, Annalise, all the other nurses, and most recently, Divya. A horrific stage play where it gladly filled all the roles. That entire month, I thought I had talked to dozens of people. In reality, it had been this goddamned mimic every single time, camouflaged by a rotating series of gruesome disguises. Hundreds of eyeless bodies hung around that room like scarecrows, arms held outstretched by the horizontal wooden poles that were tied across their backs. Thick, pulsing gray-blue tethers suspended the bodies in the air at many different elevations from somewhere high above. Despite the horrific odor, most of them seemed to be in relatively good condition, with limited visible signs of decay. The assortment of fleshy mannequins swayed lifelessly in the breeze that spilled in through the minivan's sized hole in the ceiling, glistening with some sort of varnish as they dipped in and out of beams of sunlight. Then I saw it, a gray-blue mass of muscular pulp roughly in the shape of a human being, cradling Annalise's body in its malformed arms at the center of the room. Thousands of flies' wings jutted from every inch of its flesh. Some were tiny, but others were revoltingly magnified. The largest I could see was about the size of a mailbox. Even though the thing appeared motionless, the wings jerked and twitched constantly, blurring its frame within a cloud of chaotic movement. As far as I could tell, it had its back turned to me and hadn't detected my interloping. Watching in stunned horror, the thing raised one of its hands, and I noticed it was holding something small and wooden. Every few seconds, it brought it down and delicately caressed the nurse's head with the object, dragging weathered bristles over her scalp. It was brushing Annalise's hair. Then it spoke, and I felt uncontrollable terror swim through my veins, causing my entire body to tremor like one of the abomination's wings. It sounded like 20 or 30 separate voices cooing in unison. Men, women, and even children saying the words together. A choir of the damned. Aren't we taking such good care of you? Aren't we taking such good care of you? I couldn't restrain my panic. Right before a blood-curdling wail involuntarily surged from my lips, I was saved by the thrumming of helicopter blades in the distance. The thing stopped speaking and tilted its head to the noise. At an unnaturally breakneck speed, it shot into the air and through the hole in the roof, carried into the sky by a legion of convulsing flies' wings. Then I was alone, howling into the airborne graveyard, with a myriad of preserved corpses acting as the only audience to my agony. They observed me crumble from their eyeless sockets, their stolen bodies still silently swaying in the wind. I didn't see Divya's body. Ultimately, though, I think that was for the best. After I crawled out of the hospital, it took me nearly a day to stumble across another living person, a man and his hunting dog. They delivered me to a real hospital, where I spent the next half year recuperating from the ordeal. I told the police about the plane crash, the abandoned hospital, as well as the thing and its museum of hanging bodies. They didn't dismiss my claims, nor did they call me crazy. But it was clear that they didn't plan on investigating it, either. Whatever that thing was, the detectives knew about it, and they didn't intend on interfering with its proclivities. Maybe it was just safer that way. That all took place a decade ago. Since then, I've salvaged as much of myself as I could. It hasn't been easy, but in the end, I put my life back together. Got married, had a few kids, symbolically buried Divya in a vacant grave with a tombstone. I listed her date of death as the day of the plane crash, and I hope that's actually true, but I don't know for sure, and I don't like to dwell on that fact. My biggest hurdle has been trusting people again, especially when I'm alone in a room with one other person. It feels decidedly unsafe. Checking their eye color helps, but sometimes it's not enough. What if it's that thing in disguise, looking to take me back to that godforsaken room? You might be wondering why I'm speaking up after all this time. Well, I've finally decided to post this because of what happened this afternoon. My wife returned home early from work. She's been acting odd, sitting on the couch by herself, listening but not speaking. Her eyes have always been dark blue. Today, though, they look a little different. I'm locked in our bedroom, and I can hear her saying something downstairs, but I can't discern the words. Once I post this, I'm going to open the door and find out. And I hope to God it's not what I think it is. We're going to take such good care of you.
Story 2.
You're sure this thing is for me? I asked, studying the smooth, red statue that had just been handed over. The young man on my doorstep narrowed his eyes and clenched his jaw, clearly irritated that I wasn't putting an end to this transaction as fast as humanly possible. My question wasn't rhetorical, however, so I met his gaze and waited for an answer. I wasn't about to be pushed around by a kid who probably still needed to borrow his older brother's ID to buy cigarettes. Eventually, the boy released a cartoonishly exaggerated sigh from his lips, conceding to human decency. He looked down at the clipboard, flicking his neck to move a tuft of auburn-colored bangs out of his eyes to better see the paperwork. "Well, is your dad?" He paused, flipping through the packet of papers, the edges becoming stained a faint yellow-orange from some unidentified flavor dust that lingered on his fingertips. I suppressed a gag and continued to smile weakly at the boy, who was appearing younger and younger by the second. Adrian redacted, "Yes, that's my father's name, but I haven't spoken to him in nearly 20 years. He chuckled and flipped the paperwork back to the front sheet. "Well, consider this a family reunion then, lady, 'cause you're holding him." Truthfully, I was a little flabbergasted. Adrian and I had been estranged for 2 decades. No awkward phone call at Thanksgiving. No birthday card arriving in the mail 3 weeks late. Complete and total radio silence starting the moment I left my hometown for greener pastures. He hadn't even bothered to reach out after the birth of my only son 5 years ago. I'm fairly confident he was aware of Davy's birth, too. My deadbeat sister still kept up with him, and she knew about my son. So, as I further inspected the strange effigy, I found myself asking, why weren't Dad's ashes bequeathed to Victoria? Instead, sure, she only used him for his money. To my sister, Adrian was a piggy bank with a heartbeat that she shared some genetics with. But at least she actually talked to the man. The decision to have this mailed to me upon his demise was inherently perplexing. I rolled the idol in my palm, feeling the wax drag over my skin. There was a subtle heat radiating from the object, akin to the warmth of holding a lit candle. But this thing sure wasn't a candle. I reflected it was an urn. The acne-ridden burlap sack of hormones that had been coating my property with Cheetos residue, like soot after the eruption of Pompeii, banged a pen against the clipboard. "Lady, can you and Pop-Pop catch up later? You know, like when I'm not here." I wanted nothing more than to knock the teeth out of his shit-eating grin, but I could hear Davy behind me, tapping the tip of an umbrella against the screen door, giggling and trying to get my attention. As a single parent, I was his only role model. Punching the lights out of a teenager, I contemplated probably wouldn't be a great behavior to model. With a calculated sluggishness, I picked up the pen and produced my signature on the paperwork. I took my sweet time, much to his chagrin. As soon as I dotted the last, the kid ripped the clipboard from me and turned away, stomping off to his beat-up sedan parked on the curb. "Wash your hands, champ," I shouted after him. Once he had sped away, the car's sputtering engine finally fading into nothingness, I basked in the quiet of the early evening. Chirping insects, a whistling breeze, and little else. The perpetual lullaby of sleepy suburbia. That silence made what Davy said next exceptionally odd. Mommy, it's too loud. It's really too loud," he proclaimed, dropping the umbrella to the floor, pacing away from the screen door with his hands cupped over his ears. I spun around, red effigy still radiating warmth in my palm, listening intently, searching for the noise my son was complaining about. But there was nothing. The shrill chiming of our landline greeted me as I walked into the house, screen door swinging closed behind me. I suppose now is a good time to mention this all occurred in the late 90s. Ain't no cell phones. At least I didn't have the money to afford one back then. That must be the noise Davy was upset about, I thought. Logically, though, that didn't make a lick of sense. He'd never objected to the sound of the phone ringing before, not once. I slapped the red effigy onto the kitchen table, rushing to put it down so I could answer the call before it went to voicemail. "Hello. Oh, hey, Alice." For a second, I was convinced you weren't going to pick up. "Since you've been dodging my calls, I mean." My heart sank as Victoria's nasal-toned voice sneered through the receiver. I shut my eyes and leaned my head against the kitchen wall, lamenting the choice to answer this call. "I haven't been dodging your calls, sweetheart. Being a single mom is a bit time-consuming, and I don't really have anything new to tell you. I can't repay you overnight. A few months prior, Davy had been hospitalized with pneumonia, and I was between employment, which meant we had no insurance and were paying the medical bills out of pocket. With limited options and against my better judgment, I asked my sister for a loan. Honestly, I would have been better off indebted to the Yakuza. At least when you're unable to pay them, they'll accept a pinky finger as reimbursement, according to the movie I watched at least. Okay, sweetheart, that's all well and good, but if you don't pay up soon, Child Welfare Services may get an anonymous call. A concerned citizen worried about Danny's safety in your home. Asterisk. I didn't bother correcting her for obvious reasons. If she were to ever make good on that threat, Victoria, not even knowing my son's name, would only bolster my chances at convincing social services that she was a heartless bitch, not a concerned citizen. So instead, I pulled my head from a wall and opened my eyes, about to hang up on her. Right before I placed the phone on the receiver, however, the sight of the red effigy in my peripheral vision captured my attention. I held the phone in the air, hearing distant static-laden hellos from Victoria as I stared at the object. Despite harboring my father's ashes inside its waxen confines, the figure sort of resembled a woman. It was hard to know for certain. Although it had the frame of a human being, the idol was mostly featureless. Sleek and burgundy, like red wine frozen into the shape of a person. No face, no hair, no clothes. That said, its wide hips and narrow shoulders gave it a feminine appearance. Hands clasped together in a prayer-like gesture over its chest, almost resembling a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Gazing at it so intensely eventually caused a massive shiver to explode down the length of my spine. Clunky, but forceful like a rock slide. In spite of that sensation, I was transfixed. I creeped over to the idol, on my tiptoes as if I didn't want it to hear me approach, phone still in hand. It was remained inexplicably hot to the touch as I picked it up. For a moment, I regretted signing for the ominous delivery. At the same time, what was I supposed to do? Reject my father's ashes? Even though we were estranged, that just felt wrong. As I better inspected the urn, though, my regret only became more acute. First off, there was no lid or cap to the damn thing. I assumed there would be a cork on the bottom or something, but that surface was just as smooth as the rest of it. So how did the ashes get inside? Not only that, but when I tilted the effigy upside down, desperately searching for where exactly my father's ashes had been inserted into the mold, an unexpected noise caused me to nearly jump out of my skin. It rattled. My father's supposedly cremated remains rattled. Rising fear resulted in me clumsily hurling the thing back down. If I'm remembering correctly, I basically lobbed it at the table like a softball pitch. Despite that, it didn't roll across the surface. It didn't break into a few pieces or tumble on the floor. In a singular motion, it landed perfectly upright. Somehow, the base of the effigy stuck to the table like it had been magnetized to its exterior. I slowly lifted the phone back to my ear. "You still there, Vic?" I asked, whispering. "Yeah, Jesus, I'm still here. Where'd you go?" I was totally kidding before Alice, you know that. I didn't really need that money, though. Made some shitty bets. Cutting her off before the inevitable tangent, I whispered another question. "Have you talked to Dad recently?" The line went dead. I listened to the thumping of Davy moving around in his room directly above me as I waited for a reply. Eventually, she responded, her tone laced with the faintest echoes of fear. "Maybe like a year ago. Nothing since then." "Why? You never ask about Dad. You finally reach out to him or something." Briefly, I considered answering, explaining in no uncertain terms the uncanniness of the urn that was now haunting my kitchen table. But somehow I knew I shouldn't. To this day, I can't decipher the reasoning behind my intuition. Call it an extrasensory premonition or the gut instincts of a mother, but I held my tongue. That decision likely saved mine and my son's life. I hung up without another word. It began to ring again immediately, but ignored it. Ignored it a second and a third time, too. I stood motionless in front of the landline, waiting for Victoria to give up. After the fifth unanswered call, the room finally went silent. Once a minute had passed without another ring, I felt confident that she was done extorting me. For the time being, at least. Shaking off my nervous energy with a few shoulder twists, I walked out of the kitchen, down the hallway until I reached the stairs and shouted up to Davy. "Honey, come down and help me with dinner." I heard my son erupt from his bedroom, slamming the door behind him, sneakers tapping against the floorboards as ran. When he came into view, grinning excitedly, I painted a very artificial smile on my face, masking my smoldering apprehension for his benefit. Before his foot even touched the first stair, however, his grin evaporated, replaced by a deep frown alongside a shimmer of profound worry behind his eyes. Once again, he cupped his hands over his ears and screamed down to me. "Mom, it's still too loud. The man is laughing and dancing so loud. Can you please tell him to stop?" The curves of my artificial smile began to falter and fade, despite my attempt to maintain the facade of normality. Other than my son's deafening words, the house was completely silent, devoid of any and all sound. And there was only one thing that was different. In another example of unexplainable intuition, I marched into the kitchen, picked up the effigy plus the certificate that it came with, and walked down into the cellar. Ignoring the eerie heat simmering in my palm, I made my way to the darkest corner of the unfinished basement and placed my father's rattling ashes behind a stack of winter coats. By the time I returned to the kitchen, Davy was already there, rummaging through the pantry. "All better, love bug." He paused his scavenging for a second, perking his ears. "Pretty much. I can still hear him giggling, but it doesn't hurt my head. Can we have spaghetti for dinner?" That was the worst of it for a few months. Without Davy complaining about the volume of the laughing/dancing, man, I forgot about the effigy. Make all the comments you want about my lack of supernatural vigilance. Call me a moron. Or brain dead. It's okay. I call myself all those things and much more 1,000 times over since these events. I was a single mom working 2 jobs, protecting and raising my kid the best I knew how. Credit where credit is due, though. I caught on before it was too late. It started with the ants. In the weeks prior to the delivery of the red effigy, our home had become overrun with tiny black invaders, and I couldn't afford to hire an exterminator. Instead, I settled for the much cheaper option, ant traps. At first, I thought I was wasting my money. They didn't seem to be making a dent in the infestation. Then, out of nowhere, the ants disappeared without a trace. Some kind of noiseless extinction event apparently took place without me noticing. Maybe the traps did work. Just took some time, I thought. Then, one night, I was bending over at the fridge selecting a midnight snack. As I grabbed some leftovers, the dim, phosphorescent glow coming from the appliance highlighted subtle movement by the cellar door. I stood up and squinted at the movement, but I couldn't tell what the hell it was. Honestly, it looked some invisible person was drawing a straight line in pencil between the backyard door and the entrance to the basement, obsidian graphite dragging against the tile floor. I rubbed sleep from my eyes, but the bizarre phenomena didn't change. When I flicked the kitchen light on, I better understood what was happening, but I had no clue why it was happening. A steady stream of black ants were silently making their way into the cellar, more irritated than frightened in that moment. I traced their cryptic migration down the creaky stairs, assuming they had been attracted to some food Davy absent-mindedly left down there. But when I saw that the procession of living dots were heading for the area behind the winter coats, the irritation spilled from my pores with the sweat that was starting to drench my t-shirt, and then fear was the only emotion left inside me. I hadn't thought about the red effigy in some time. As I peeked behind the stack of fleeces and windbreakers, I almost didn't recognize it. It had tripled in size. The figure wasn't praying anymore, either. Now it was lying in the fetal position, knees tucked to its chest, head resting on the ground. Ants entered the wax, but they didn't come out. One by one, they gave their bodies to the red effigy. As my horror hit a fever pitch, vibrating in my chest like a suffocating hummingbird, I could have sworn the idol tilted its smooth, featureless face to glare at me. I swung around and bolted up the stairs. Didn't sleep much that night. Not a wink after what I witnessed in the cellar. I paced manic laps around the first floor of my home all through the night, desperately trying to process the encounter. As the sun rose, however, I hadn't figured much out. I wasn't convinced what I saw was real. If it was real, God forbid, I had no fucking idea what to do about it. Exhausted to where I became fearless and dumb, I plodded the stairs, snow shovel in hand, determined to throw my father's supposedly incinerated corpse into the garbage. The morning light pouring in through a dusty window near the ceiling made the process exponentially less terrifying, at least at first. When I reached the idol, I came to the gut-wrenching conclusion that I hadn't hallucinated its transformation. It was still the size of a toddler. I didn't dwell on the unexplainable. That would have paralyzed me to the point of catatonia. Instead, I focused my attention solely on getting that red curse out of my fucking house. I arced back with the shovel and slid it under the wax. Briefly, I stopped, readying myself to sprint out of the cellar at breakneck speed if the effigy came to life in response to my intrusion. It remained inanimate, and I cautiously placed my hands back on the handle, attempting to lift the wax idol. Attempting and failing to lift it. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how much energy I put into the action, it wouldn't budge. I couldn't move an inch. Dumbfounded, I let the shovel clatter to the floor and left the cellar to get Davy ready for school. Locked the door behind me, just in case. Over the next week, I enlisted 3 separate men, each of them strapping and Herculean in their own right, to help me try to move the blossoming urn. Instructed them not to touch it. Another baseless intuition that turned out to be correct when it was put to the test. My ex-boyfriend couldn't lift it with the shovel, and he was able to bench press 400 pounds. My plumber, a person I'd been friendly with for years, couldn't lift it either. When he tried to push the idol as opposed to lifting it with the shovel, the grizzled man screamed bloody murder, having sustained third-degree burns on the inside of both hands from the attempt. My pastor wouldn't even go into the cellar. He gripped the golden cross around his neck as he peered into the depths, quivering and wide-eyed. Told me I needed someone to exorcise the property as he jogged out the door. I asked him if knew any such person, but he said nothing and continued on jogging. In a moment of obscene bravery, I went into the cellar by myself and retrieved the certificate that came with the idol. If strength wasn't the answer, then I needed a more cunning approach. Figured reviewing the documentation that came with it was a good place to start. There wasn't much to review, however. The certificate barely had anything on it other than my father's name. As I stared at the piece of paper, try to will an epiphany into existence, I noticed something that caused my heart to drop into my stomach like a cannonball. Although I made it manifest, the epiphany didn't help me much in the end, unfortunately. My father's middle initial was T, but the paper listed his middle initial as L. All the men on my dad's side of my family were named Adrian, as it would happen. If the certificate was to be believed, this wasn't my father's ashes. It was my great-grandfather's ashes. The last night Davy and I stayed in that house, I jolted awake to the sound of my son shrieking from somewhere below me. Ever since I discovered the red effigy had grown, he had been sleeping in my bedroom, right next to me. My son wasn't in bed when I heard the wails, so I launched myself out of bed, sprinting toward the cellar. If I had been paying more attention, I may have noticed the light under the closed bathroom door that I passed on my way there. Seconds later, I was at the bottom of the basement stairs. I flipped the cellar light on, but the bulb must have burnt out because nothing happened. In the darkness, I could faintly see Davy kneeling over the red effigy, screaming in pain. Before I could even think, I was across the room, reaching out my hand to grab my son's shoulder and pull him away from it, when I heard another noise from behind me. Instantly, I halted my forward motion, fingertips hanging inches above the shadow-cloaked figure I assumed was my son. "Mom! Mom! Who's screaming?" Davy shouted from the top of the cellar stairs. My brain struggled to process the bombardment of sensations, emotions, and conflicting pieces of information. I lingered in that position, statuesque and petrified, until an onslaught of searing agony wrenched me from my daze. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see two shapes in front of me, and neither of them were Davy. There was the idol, still curled into the fetal position, and then there was the thing I was leaning over, which was just the thin silhouette of a child's head and shoulders without any other body parts, connected to the idol by a waxy thread that had been hidden from view by the pile of coats. A tendril had grown from the silhouette's head and was now enveloping the ring and middle fingers of my outstretched hand. Never in my life have I experienced a more devastating pain. With all the force I could muster, I threw myself backward. There were the sickening snaps of tendons accompanied by the high-pitched crunching of knuckles, and then my spine hit the ground hard. Both of my fingers had been torn off, absorbed into the wax, leaving two bleeding stumps on my hand, fragments of bone jutting out of the ruptured flesh like marble gravestones. Adrenaline, thankfully, is an astounding painkiller. By the time I had scooped up Davy, put him in the car, and started accelerating away from that house, I didn't feel a thing anymore. While I was being treated for my injuries at the hospital, I contemplated what to do next. My fear was that this thing wanted specifically me or my son, and wouldn't settle for anyone else. So even if I moved me and Davy across the country, jumping from shelter to shelter, would that really be enough? Will we ever truly be safe? In the end, I'm sort of grateful that the idol ingested those two fingers. Being with Davy in the same hospital that had treated him for pneumonia reminded of my debt, and that gave an idea. If the red effigy wanted us, maybe I could offer it a close second. Once I had been stitched up, I picked up the phone and called Victoria. "Hey, I have a proposition for you. I'll give you the house as compensation for my debt, as long as you throw in a few grand on top. You can easily sell it for 20 times that, you know." Never heard from Victoria again after I traded the deed for cash. Davy and I moved across the country, starting fresh in a new city. No surprise deliveries at our new home for over 20 years, either. Until now. Today is my birthday, and I received something in the mail. The return address is our old home. With trembling hands, I peeled the letter open and removed the card that was inside. Here's what the message said. "Dear Alice, I apologize about not reaching out all these years. Truthfully, I imagined you'd still be angry at me and Granddad. But I'm hoping you'll get this card and let bygones be bygones. I want you to know that Victoria was my first choice for the urn. However, at the time, she owed me a great deal of money. To avoid payment, your sister convinced me she was in prison, which made her an unsuitable choice for what I would expect are obvious reasons after what happened to your fingers. In the end, however, I suppose it all worked out as it was meant to. Please call XXXXXXXX. I look forward to 4 of us spending time together. Happy birthday, Dad." Attached, there's a Polaroid of my father and another man standing next to him. Dad looks exactly as I remember him when I left home, and that was almost half a century ago. And the other man looks a lot like him. Davy is away at college. He hasn't answered my calls for the last 2 days. Once I post this, I suppose I'll call my father. Wish me luck. That's it for today's creepy Reddit tales. Before we go, I just want to say a quick thanks to all of you for watching, liking, and sticking around. You guys keep this channel going, and I'll be back soon with more stories that'll make your skin crawl. Drop a comment if you've got your own spooky tale to share, and I'll see you in the next one.